Clara Blackett clutched her market basket tighter as the snickers behind her grew louder, her cheeks burning with the shame that had followed her like a shadow through the dusty streets of Wyatt, Colorado. It was 1875, and at 22 years old, she still couldn't tell the difference between the words flour and sugar on the general store shelves, forced to point mutely at what she needed while townsfolk whispered behind raised hands. "Look at her, dumb as a fence post," came a harsh whisper that wasn't meant to be quiet. "Can't even read the simplest words. What kind of grown woman can't read her own name?" Clara kept her eyes fixed on the wooden floorboards, counting the knots in the pine as she'd learned to do whenever the mockery started. 1, 2, 3 knots. She'd count until the burning in her eyes subsided. The general store owner, Mr. Hawkins, was at least kind enough to help her without making a spectacle, unlike his wife who seemed to delight in Clara's struggle. "That'll be 35 cents, Miss Blackett," Mr. Hawkins said gently, wrapping her purchases in brown paper. Clara nodded gratefully, carefully counting out her coins. Numbers she understood her father had taught her those before the fever took him and her mother 3 winters ago. She might not read, but she could count change better than most, a small pride she held tight. As she turned to leave, she collided with a solid wall of a man, her basket tumbling from her grip. Cans rolled across the floor as gasps and renewed laughter erupted around her. "I am so sorry, miss," came a deep voice as strong hands steadied her shoulders. Clara looked up into the face of a man she'd seen around town, but never spoken to, tall and broad-shouldered with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of warm whiskey. His dark brown hat was pushed back on his head, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his temples. "It's no trouble," she mumbled, dropping to her knees to gather her scattered purchases before anyone could see the tears threatening to spill. He knelt beside her, helping collect the items. "Name's Daniel Zachary," he said, reaching for a can that had rolled beneath a nearby display. "Most folks call me Dan. I run the cattle operation north of town," Clara nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Clara Blackett." His fingers brushed hers as he handed her the last item, and something warm fluttered in her chest despite her embarrassment. "Miss Blackett, Mrs." Hawkins called sharply from behind the counter, holding up a piece of paper. "You forgot to sign for your account." The flutter in Clara's chest turned to ice. The ledger. She always dreaded this moment, the public admission of her shameful secret. "I'll just mark her X as usual, Martha," Mr. Hawkins said quietly, but Mrs. Hawkins wasn't to be denied her entertainment. "Nonsense. Everyone must sign properly. Store policy." Her thin lips curled into what might have been a smile but held no warmth. Clara stood frozen, the basket heavy in her hands. The store had fallen silent, all eyes on her humiliation. "I'll sign as witness," Daniel said suddenly, stepping forward and taking the pencil. He scrawled his name quickly, then turned to Clara with a smile that held no mockery. "They're now all settled." The reprieve was temporary, but Clara felt a rush of gratitude as she hurried out of the store, the whispers following her like autumn leaves in the wind. She didn't expect to see Daniel Zachary again, certainly not standing on her porch later that evening as she returned from feeding the few chickens she kept behind her small home at the edge of town. "Mr. Zachary," she said, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "Is there something I can help you with?" He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "I wondered if I might help you, Miss Blackett." Clara's spine stiffened. "I don't need charity, sir." "Not charity," he said quickly. "An exchange. I've been watching you manage this place alone since your parents passed. You grow the finest vegetables in the county. I could use some help with the cooking and keeping at my ranch, and in return—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "In return, I thought I might teach you your letters." Heat rushed to Clara's face. "You heard them, in the store." "I did," he admitted. "And I thought it a sorry thing that folks would mock someone for something they never had the chance to learn. And why would you care to teach me?" She asked, suspicion edging her voice. Men didn't offer things without wanting something in return. She'd learned that lesson well enough. Daniel's expression softened. My mother couldn't read neither, till my pa taught her. She was the smartest woman I ever knew, just never had the schooling. I reckon it's a cruelty to judge folks for what they ain't been given the chance to learn. Clara studied his face for any sign of mockery or ulterior motive, but found only earnestness in those whiskey-colored eyes. I can't leave my place, she said finally. I've got my garden and chickens. I could come here evenings after work, he offered. Wouldn't take but an hour or two, few times a week. The idea was tempting, so tempting it frightened her, to read her own name, to decipher the mysterious symbols that excluded her from so much of the world. But the risk of further humiliation if she failed. Why would you bother? She asked softly. Daniel's smile reached his eyes. Everyone deserves a chance, Miss Blackett. My ma always said knowledge is the one thing nobody can take from you once you've got it. Clara looked down at her work roughened hands, then back at this man who offered her what no one else ever had possibility. Tuesdays and Thursdays, she said finally. After sundown, I can trade you vegetables and eggs for your trouble. Deal, he said, settling his hat back on his head. I'll bring the books. You just have a candle ready. That Thursday evening, Clara's hands shook as she set 2 candles on her small kitchen table. She'd scrubbed the little house from top to bottom, embarrassed by the simplicity of her home but determined to present it at its best. The cabin was modest, just 2 rooms with the kitchen doubling as a living area and a small bedroom behind a curtain, but it was hers, free and clear. When Daniel knocked at her door precisely as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Clara jumped, nearly knocking over one of the candles in her nervousness. He stood on her porch with a leather satchel and a friendly smile. Evening, Miss Blackett. Please call me Clara, she said, stepping back to let him enter. If you're to be teaching me like a child, we needn't stand on formality. Nothing childish about learning at any age, Daniel replied, setting his satchel on the table. And if I'm to call you Clara, you must call me Daniel. Clara nodded, gesturing to the chair she'd prepared for him. Would you care for some tea? That would be kind, thank you. As Clara busied herself with the kettle, Daniel pulled several items from his satchel, a thin book with a blue cover, a slate, some chalk, and a sheaf of papers. My mother kept these, he explained, handling the papers with care. They're the exercises my father made for her when he was teaching her. I thought they might help us start. Clara set the tea before him, then tentatively took the seat across the table. The papers were covered in careful, even handwriting letters formed with precision, simple words repeated down the page. We'll start with your name, Daniel said, picking up the chalk. Every person should be able to write their own name. He wrote on the slate in bold, clear letters, Clara. These are the letters that make up your name, he explained. CLRA, each one has a sound. When you put them together, they make the word Clara. Clara stared at the white marks on the black slate, her heart pounding. There it was, her name, captured in 5 mysterious symbols that had eluded her all her life. The C makes a sound like this, Daniel said, demonstrating the hard C sound. And each letter has its own sound. Together they make your name. For the next hour, Daniel patiently helped Clara trace each letter of her name with the chalk, explaining the sound each made, guiding her hand when she struggled with the curves of the C and the R. By the end of the hour, Clara had written her name 5 times, each attempt more confident than the last. When she completed the final attempt without his guidance, a sense of accomplishment swelled within her that she'd never known before. There it was, Clara written by her own hand. I did it, she whispered, staring at the slate. You certainly did, Daniel said, his voice warm with approval. And that's just the beginning. When he left that night, promising to return on Tuesday, Clara stood in her doorway watching his tall figure disappear down the moonlit path. She closed the door and leaned against it, clutching the small slate he'd insisted she keep for practice. For the first time in her life, she felt something long dormant within her stirring to life hope. The weeks that followed established a rhythm to Clara's life that she'd never known before. Tuesdays and Thursdays became sacred, her days revolving around those evenings when Daniel would arrive with his satchel of books and papers. By the light of candles, hunched over her small table, Clara's world began to expand letter by letter. Daniel proved to be a patient teacher. Unlike the schoolmarm who had rapped Clara's knuckles with a ruler for her slowness when she was a child before her father had finally pulled her from school in humiliation, Daniel never showed frustration. When Clara struggled to remember the difference between B and D, he created memory tricks rather than criticism. "The B has its belly first, then its straight back," he would say, guiding her hand to form the letter. "The D has its back first, then its belly." Like they're facing different directions. By the end of the first month, Clara could write not only her name but a dozen common words. By the second month, she was piecing together simple sentences, sounding out the words letter by letter, the pride of recognition blooming on her face when she succeeded. "You're progressing faster than anyone I've ever seen," Daniel told her one evening in late summer as they sat on her porch, taking advantage of the long daylight hours. "You've got a natural mind for this." Clara ducked her head, pleased by the praise but still unused to receiving compliments. "I've just had a good teacher." "You've had determination," he corrected. "Most folks would have given up by now." Clara looked out over her small garden, lush with summer vegetables. "I suppose I'm used to seeing things through. Plants don't grow if you give up on them at the first dry spell." Daniel followed her gaze. "Your garden truly is remarkable, the way you've laid it out, how you've got those beans climbing up corn stalks instead of separate poles. That's smart thinking." "My mother taught me that." "The corn gives the beans something to climb, and the beans put something back in the soil that helps the corn grow." Clara smiled at the memory. She knew all sorts of things like that, practical things. She could look at the sky and tell you if rain was coming 3 days out. Sounds like she was a wise woman. "She was," Clara said softly. "She couldn't read either, but she always said that didn't mean she wasn't smart, just that she was smart about different things than most folk value." Daniel nodded. "That's the truth of it. There's book learning and there's life learning, and most folks could use more of both." Their conversations had grown easier over the weeks. At first, Clara had been stiff and formal, afraid to reveal too much of herself, but Daniel had a way of drawing her out. He shared stories of his own life, how he'd come west with his parents as a boy, how his father had built their ranch from nothing, how he'd taken over after his parents died within a year of each other. "It's hard, losing them both so close together," Clara had said, understanding his loss. "It is," he'd agreed, "but they left me something to build on. That's more than many get." As summer waned into fall, their lessons extended beyond the basic mechanics of reading and writing. Daniel brought newspapers for Clara to practice with, explaining current events as they worked through the articles. He brought books, simple ones at first, then more complex stories as her skills improved. The candlelight sessions lengthened as the days grew shorter. Sometimes they would finish a lesson and Daniel would remain, discussing books or sharing tales of ranch life while Clara served tea and whatever baked goods she'd prepared. She found herself looking forward not just to the lessons but to his company. For his part, Daniel seemed in no hurry to leave after their studies concluded. He would help her wash the teacups, listening intently as she shared stories of her childhood or explained her methods for preserving the fall harvest. One Tuesday in mid-October, Daniel arrived looking unusually tired, his normally immaculate shirt dusty from the trail. "You look exhausted," Clara said, taking his hat and coat. "Hard day at the ranch." "Three calves decided today was the day to find every hole in the fence," he said with a rueful smile. "Spent most of it chasing them across half the county." Clara hesitated. "Perhaps we should skip today's lesson. You need rest." "Not on your life," Daniel said, settling into his usual chair. "This is the part of my day I look forward to most." The words hung between them, simple but laden with meaning. Clara felt her cheeks warm as she busied herself with the tea kettle. That evening they worked on a passage from Little Women, a book Daniel had brought the week before. Clara read aloud, carefully sounding out the more difficult words while Daniel listened with evident pride. "Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents," Clara reads slowly, gaining confidence with each word. "It's so dreadful to be poor," sighed Meg, looking down at her old dress. "Excellent," Daniel said when she completed the paragraph. "Your reading is becoming more fluid every week." Clara traced the edge of the page with her finger. "It's amazing to think that all these stories have been here all along, waiting for me to discover them." "There's a whole world in books," Daniel agreed. "My mother used to say that reading was like having a magic carpet. You could go anywhere, be anyone." "I never imagined I could do this," Clara admitted. "After they pulled me from school, I just accepted that some things weren't meant for me." Daniel's expression grew serious. "Who told you that you couldn't learn?" Clara shrugged, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "No one had to say it outright. The schoolmarm called me slow-witted in front of everyone. The other children laughed. My father thought he was protecting me by keeping me home." "There's nothing slow about your mind, Clara Blackett," Daniel said firmly. "You've learned in months what takes some folks years. Only because you've been patient enough to show me properly." The candles had burned low, casting long shadows across the table. In the soft light, Daniel's expression was gentle as he reached across and briefly covered her hand with his own. "I'm not just being kind," he said. "You've got a quick mind and a determined spirit. That's rare." The touch of his hand sent a strange flutter through Clara's chest. She withdrew her hand, not out of displeasure but because the sensation confused her. "It's getting late," she said, rising from the table. "You've got a long ride back." Daniel nodded, gathering his things. At the door, he paused. "I've been thinking. There's a social at the church this Saturday. Would you consider attending with me?" Clara froze. She'd avoided town gatherings for years, tired of the sidelong glances and whispers. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "People talk." "Let them," Daniel said with a shrug. "You've nothing to be ashamed of. Besides," he added with a smile, "I'd like to introduce my reading pupil to my friends, show them how far you've come." The pride in his voice gave Clara pause. The idea of walking into that church on Daniel's arm made her both terrified and strangely excited. "I'll think about it," she promised. After he left, Clara sat for a long time at her table, the candles burning down to stubs. A social meant dressing up, making conversation, facing those who had mocked her for so long. But it also meant spending time with Daniel outside of their lessons, seeing if the warmth she felt in his presence extended beyond her little cabin. By Saturday morning, Clara had changed her mind a dozen times. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened, she found herself drawing a bath, washing her hair, and laying out her one good dress, a simple blue cotton that had been her mother's, altered to fit her smaller frame. When Daniel knocked at her door at 6:30, Clara was ready, her hair pinned neatly. Her mother's small pearl earrings her only adornment. Daniel's expression when she opened the door made all her preparations worthwhile. He stood speechless for a moment, his eyes taking in the transformation. "You look beautiful," he said finally, offering his arm. The church hall was decorated with autumn leaves and candles, a small band playing in one corner. When Clara entered on Daniel's arm, she felt the stares immediately. Mrs. Hawkins from the general store leaned to whisper to her companion, eyes darting toward Clara. "Ignore them," Daniel murmured, guiding her toward a table where punch was being served. Throughout the evening, Daniel stayed close, introducing her to ranchers and townspeople she'd seen but never spoken to. To Clara's surprise, many were welcoming, showing none of the condescension she'd come to expect. "Daniel tells me you grow the best tomatoes in the county," said Mrs. Miller, the blacksmith's wife. "I'd love to know your secret. Mine always split before they ripen." Clara found herself engaged in a detailed discussion of gardening techniques, momentarily forgetting her nervousness. As the conversation flowed, she realized with surprise that she was enjoying herself. Later, when the band struck up a waltz, Daniel extended his hand. Would you do me the honor? I don't know how to dance properly, Clara admitted. I'll teach you, he replied with a smile. Just as you've taught me about growing things. On the small dance floor, Daniel guided her gently, his hand warm at her waist. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, he counted softly, just for her ears. Just like learning letters, it's all patterns. Clara followed his lead, gradually relaxing into the movement. I never thought I'd be here, she confessed. Dancing at a social. I'm glad you are, Daniel said, his eyes never leaving hers. Very glad indeed. As they danced, Clara became aware of whispers and glances, some curious, some disapproving. Mrs. Hawkins and her friends watched from the corner, their expressions sour. People are talking, Clara murmured. People always talk, Daniel replied easily. Especially when they've nothing better to do. The music ended, and as they made their way back to their seats, Mrs. Hawkins intercepted them, her thin face arranged in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Zachary, she said warmly before turning a cooler gaze on Clara. And Miss Blackett. How unexpected to see you here, Mrs. Hawkins, Daniel acknowledged with a tip of his head. Clara was kind enough to accompany me this evening. Indeed, Mrs. Hawkins said, her eyes narrowing. I was just telling Mrs. Palmer how surprised I was to see our local recluse in attendance. Tell me, Miss Blackett, have you finally learned to sign your name properly? Or does Mr. Zachary still need to do that for you? Clara felt her face flame with humiliation as several nearby conversations faltered. Before she could respond, Daniel spoke, his voice pleasant but firm. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Hawkins, Clara has become quite accomplished. She's reading Little Women at present, a fine novel. Have you read it yourself? Mrs. Hawkins blinked, caught off guard. Of course I have. Then you'll remember that it begins with the March sisters lamenting their poverty at Christmas, Daniel continued. Clara was just discussing with me yesterday how Alcott's portrayal of familial love despite hardship resonated with her own experiences. Clara stared at Daniel in amazement, recognizing the passage they had been working on. Mrs. Hawkins looked between them, clearly flustered. Well, she said finally. How nice. As she retreated, Daniel leaned close to Clara. I apologize for speaking for you. I just couldn't bear to see her treat you that way. No one's ever defended me before, Clara said softly. Thank you. The rest of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. Daniel introduced her to more of his acquaintances, danced with her twice more, and kept up a steady stream of conversation that put her at ease. By the time he escorted her home, Clara felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. On her porch, Daniel took her hand. Thank you for coming tonight. I hope you enjoyed yourself despite Mrs. Hawkins. I did, Clara admitted. More than I expected to. Good, he said, his voice dropping lower, because I'd very much like to take you to the Harvest Festival next month. Clara looked up at him, searching his face in the moonlight. Why are you doing all this, Daniel? The lessons, the social. Why me? Daniel was quiet for a moment, still holding her hand. When I first saw you in town, always keeping to yourself, I was curious. Then that day in the store, when I saw how they treated you and how you held your dignity despite it all, I admired that. And now, getting to know you these past months. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I've come to care for you, Clara, very much. The simple honesty in his voice made Clara's heart beat faster. No one had ever spoken to her this way before. I care for you too, she whispered, the words feeling both frightening and right. Daniel's smile was gentle as he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. Then I'll see you Tuesday for our lesson. As she watched him ride away, Clara touched the spot where his lips had brushed her skin, a new feeling blooming in her chest, something warm and hopeful that felt remarkably like happiness. The following weeks brought changes to their routine. The lessons continued, but now they were interspersed with other activities. Daniel would arrive with books and slates, but also with invitations, a Sunday drive to see the autumn colors, an afternoon fishing at the creek, a visit to his ranch to show her the improvements he was making to the main house. Clara's reading improved steadily, her confidence growing with each small victory. By early November, she could read simple stories on her own, writing down her thoughts in a small journal Daniel had given her to practice. "My mother used to keep a journal," he told her as she ran her fingers over the leather cover. She said it helped her practice her writing, but also to make sense of her thoughts. Clara treasured the gift, filling pages each night with careful letters that gradually became more fluid. She wrote about her daily activities, her garden plans for the spring, and increasingly about Daniel, his kindness, his patience, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Their Tuesday lesson in mid-November was interrupted by a fierce snowstorm that blew in suddenly from the mountains. Wind howled around Clara's small cabin, rattling the windows as Daniel looked concernedly outside. "I should head back before this gets worse," he said, gathering his things. Clara peered into the white fury outside. "It's already worse. You can't ride in that, you'd never find your way." Daniel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the propriety of the situation. "I don't want to compromise your reputation, Clara. I'd rather have your life intact than my reputation," she replied firmly. "You can take my bed, I'll sleep by the fire." After some argument, they compromised. Daniel would sleep on a pallet by the fire, and Clara would take her bed behind the curtain that separated her sleeping area from the main room. The storm continued into the night, the wind finding every crack in the cabin's walls. Clara lay awake, listening to the occasional creak of floorboards as Daniel shifted on his makeshift bed. "Are you warm enough out there?" she called softly. "I'm fine," came his reply. "Your quilt is thicker than it looks." Clara smiled in the darkness. "My mother made it. She used old wool coats for the batting." "Your mother was a resourceful woman." "She was," Clara agreed, listening to the wind. After a moment, she asked, "Would you tell me more about your mother, how your father taught her to read?" Daniel was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might have fallen asleep. Then his voice came through the darkness, soft but clear. "My father met her when she was working as a laundress in St. Louis. He always said he fell in love with her laugh, first said it was like sunshine breaking through clouds. She was 17, he was 22. Her family had come over from Ireland during the famine, but they died of fever shortly after arriving. She'd been on her own since she was 12. Clara listened, imagining the young woman working her fingers raw in steaming laundry water. Pa said he knew she was the one when he saw how she handled the account books at the laundry, Daniel continued. She couldn't read a word, but she developed her own system of marks to keep track of who owed what. When he asked how she did it, she showed him all these little symbols she'd invented, different marks for different customers. He said it was the cleverest thing he'd ever seen. "That was ingenious of her," Clara murmured. "They married 3 months later," Daniel said. "On their wedding night, he gave her a book of poetry and promised to teach her to read it. Every night for a year, they sat together by lamplight. Pa said sometimes she'd cry from frustration, but she never gave up. By the time I was born 2 years later, she could read anything she put her mind to." Clara thought of her own struggles, the moments of despair when letters seemed to swim before her eyes. She must have been very determined. "She was," Daniel agreed, his voice warm with memory. "Once she could read, there was no stopping her. Our house was full of books, history, science, poetry. She read to me every night before bed, said books were doorways to places we might never see in person." The wind gusted, sending a shower of snow against the window. In the comfortable darkness, Clara found courage for a question she'd been holding back. "Daniel, why did you really decide to teach me the truth?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the dying fire. "The first time I saw you," he finally said, "was last spring. You were at the edge of town, helping old Mrs. Jenkins carry her groceries. She was leaning heavy on her cane, and you had both her basket and your own. Later that same day, I saw some of the town ladies snickering as you left the general store, and how you kept your head high despite it." Clara remembered that day Mrs. Jenkins had been recovering from a fall, and Clara had encountered her struggling on the path. I asked around about you, Daniel continued. Heard about your parents passing, how you kept that place going all on your own. Heard the whispers about you not being able to read, and it reminded me so much of my mother's stories. He paused, and Clara could hear him shifting on his pallet. But it was that day in the store when Mrs. Hawkins tried to humiliate you with that ledger. The look in your eyes wasn't shame, Clara, it was defiance. That's when I knew I wanted to know you better. Clara lay still, absorbing his words, her heart beating a rapid rhythm in her chest. Thank you for telling me, she said softly. And thank you for seeing me, really seeing me when most people just looked past. I see you, Clara Blackett, came his quiet reply. More clearly every day, morning brought clear skies and a transformed world. Everything was blanketed in pristine white, the storm having left nearly 2 feet of snow in its wake. Daniel and Clara shared a simple breakfast of porridge and dried apples before he reluctantly prepared to leave. I need to check on the cattle, he explained, wrapping his scarf tightly. This much snow can cause problems with the feed. Clara nodded, watching him bundle up against the cold. Something had shifted between them during the night's conversation, a deeper understanding, a growing trust. Be careful on the ride back, she said, handing him a package of leftover biscuits for the journey. The drifts can be deceptive. Daniel paused at the door, looking down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. I'll see you Thursday, he said, then hesitated before adding, unless the weather turns again. Then I'll come Friday. I'll be here, Clara replied, suddenly shy under his gaze. He nodded once, then leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. Before she could react, he was gone, trudging through the snow to where his horse waited in her small barn. Clara touched her cheek where his lips had been, watching through the window as he rode away, a solitary figure against the vast whiteness. The weeks leading up to Christmas passed in a flurry of activity. Clara's reading progressed to the point where she could manage simple novels with only occasional help, each new accomplishment celebrated with quiet pride by both student and teacher. Their lessons often evolved into long conversations by the fire, mugs of hot cider warming their hands as they discussed books, ideas, and dreams. Daniel spoke of his plans for expanding his ranch, building a larger house to replace the modest one his father had constructed. Clara shared her hopes of adding fruit trees to her property, perhaps selling preserves in town when they began bearing. You could have a proper orchard, Daniel suggested one evening. That south-facing slope behind your chicken coop gets good sun, it would be perfect for apples and pears. Clara smiled at his enthusiasm. It takes years for fruit trees to produce. That's a lot of waiting. Some things are worth waiting for, he replied, holding her gaze until she blushed and looked away. These moments of connection were happening more frequently, lingering glances, hands brushing as they turned pages, conversations that continued late into the evening. Sometimes Daniel would read to her, his deep voice bringing stories to life in the candlelight. Other times, Clara would practice her new skills by reading to him, gaining confidence with each successfully navigated passage. 2 days before Christmas, Daniel arrived with his usual satchel of books but also a small pine tree strapped to his saddle. What's this? Clara asked as he propped it against her porch. Every home should have a Christmas tree, he said, stamping snow from his boots. I thought we might decorate it together. The simple gesture brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes. Since her parents' deaths, she hadn't bothered with Christmas decorations. The holiday had become just another quiet day of solitude. Together, they set the tree in a bucket by the window. Daniel produced a small bag of ornaments, simple wooden shapes he'd carved himself, plus strands of dried berries and popcorn he'd brought to string. These are beautiful, Clara said, running her finger over a delicate wooden star. Did you make them all? Daniel nodded, a touch of color rising in his cheeks. My father taught me whittling when I was a boy. It passes the time on winter evenings. They spent the evening decorating the tree, stringing berries and hanging the wooden ornaments. When they finished, Daniel lit a candle and carefully placed it near the tree, the light casting a warm glow across the room. "It's perfect," Clara whispered, standing back to admire their work. "Almost perfect," Daniel corrected, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "This is for you for Christmas." Clara took the package, surprised by its weight. "But I haven't anything for you." "You've given me plenty," he assured her. "Your company these past months has been gift enough." With trembling fingers, Clara untied the string and unfolded the paper. Inside was a book, not one of the simple readers they'd been using, but a beautiful volume bound in dark green leather with gold lettering on the spine. Complete works of William Shakespeare. "It was my mother's," Daniel explained as Clara ran her fingers reverently over the cover. "Her favorite. She used to read the sonnets aloud when she was happy." "Daniel, I can't accept this," Clara protested. "It's too precious." He took her hands, closing them around the book. "I want you to have it. She would have liked you would have approved of passing it on to someone who understands what it means to work for knowledge." Clara looked up at him, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Thank you," she managed. "I'll treasure it always." Daniel's hands remained around hers, warm and strong. In the soft light of the candle, his face was half in shadow, his eyes dark and intent on hers. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward. Their first real kiss was gentle, a question rather than a demand. Clara froze for a moment, surprised despite the building tension of recent weeks. Then she responded, her lips softening under his, her heart racing like a startled deer. When they parted, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for some time now," he confessed. "I'm glad you did," Clara whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I should go, it's getting late." Clara nodded, though part of her wished he would stay. At the door, he turned back. "Would you spend Christmas Day with me?" "At the ranch. I'd like to show you the place properly, not just the quick tour we did before." The invitation hung between them, its significance clear. Meeting at her cabin for lessons was one thing, visiting his home on Christmas Day no less was a declaration of sorts. "I'd like that," Clara said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. His smile was bright enough to rival the candles. "I'll come fetch you around noon." Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the world glittering under a fresh dusting of snow. Clara had risen before dawn, too excited to sleep, and spent the morning preparing a basket of food to contribute to their Christmas meal: fresh bread, preserved peaches from the summer, and cookies she'd baked using a recipe from memory. She dressed with care in her best dress, a deep burgundy wool that had been altered from one of her mother's. Her hair she arranged in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, adorned with a ribbon that matched her dress. Daniel arrived precisely at noon, driving a sleigh rather than riding horseback. "It seemed more fitting for the occasion," he explained, helping her up to the seat beside him. He tucked a thick buffalo robe around her legs against the cold, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary. The ride to the Zachary ranch took nearly an hour, the sleigh gliding smoothly over the packed snow. As they crested the final hill, Clara caught her breath at the vista spread before them. The ranch was larger than she'd imagined, a sprawling property nestled in a sheltered valley. A substantial log house stood proudly on a rise, smoke curling from its chimney. Below it, several outbuildings formed a neat compound, and beyond them, fenced pastures stretched into the distance, dotted with cattle. "It's beautiful," Clara said, taking in the peaceful scene. "It's home," Daniel replied simply, urging the horses forward. As they approached, Clara noticed holiday greenery adorning the porch and windows of the main house. A large wreath hung on the front door and candles glowed warmly in every window. "Did you do all this decorating yourself?" she asked, impressed by the festive display. Daniel chuckled. "I had some help. Mrs. Ramsey comes from town 3 times a week to cook and clean. She insisted the place needed a proper Christmas touch, as she called it." Inside, the house was even more impressive. The main room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a cheery fire crackled. Comfortable furniture was arranged around it, much of it hand-crafted from local timber. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes of all sizes. "My mother's collection," Daniel explained, following her gaze to the books. "And some I've added over the years." Clara moved to the shelves, running her fingers along the spines, able now to read many of the titles. There must be hundreds. 342 at last count, he said with a smile, though I've probably added a dozen since then. He gave her a tour of the house, the dining room with its long oak table, the study where he kept the ranch accounts, the kitchen where delicious smells were emanating from a pot bubbling on the stove. "Mrs. Ramsay prepared everything before she left for her daughters yesterday," he explained. "Just needs heating." Together, they prepared the Christmas meal, working side by side in comfortable companionship. Daniel carved a roast while Clara warmed the vegetables and gravy Mrs. Ramsay had left. They set the table with china that had belonged to Daniel's mother, and he lit candles despite the early afternoon hour. "To make it special," he said when Clara remarked on it, the meal was the finest Clara had eaten in years. They talked easily, sharing stories and laughter, the awkwardness that might have accompanied such an intimate setting dissolving in the warmth of their growing connection. After they'd cleared away the dishes, Daniel led her back to the main room where the fire had been built up against the deepening cold outside. "I have something else for you," he said, retrieving a package from beneath a small Christmas tree in the corner that Clara hadn't noticed earlier. "But you've already given me the book," she protested, "and this wonderful day." "This is different," he said, placing the package in her hands. "Open it." Inside was a slate, not the simple school slate they'd been using for her lessons, but a fine one framed in polished wood with an inlaid border of lighter wood creating a delicate pattern. "It's beautiful," Clara said, admiring the craftsmanship. "Turn it over," Daniel urged. On the back, inlaid in the same light wood, were words, "To Clara who found her voice. Christmas 1875. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "Did you make this?" Daniel nodded, suddenly looking uncertain. "Do you like it?" In answer, Clara leaned forward and kissed him, surprising them both with her boldness. When they parted, she was blushing but smiling. "I love it," she said simply. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." They spent the remainder of the afternoon and early evening talking by the fire. As dusk fell, Daniel reluctantly acknowledged that they should start back before full darkness made the journey difficult. On the ride home, Clara sat closer to Daniel than she had on the journey out, their shoulders touching beneath the buffalo robe. The stars were emerging in the clear winter sky, brilliant against the deepening blue. "Thank you for today," she said as they approached her cabin. "It was perfect." "It was just the beginning," Daniel replied, his voice low and certain. At her door, he kissed her again, longer this time, his arms wrapping around her waist to draw her closer. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "Good night, Clara," he whispered. "Good night, Daniel," she replied, watching as he returned to the sleigh and disappeared into the darkness. Inside, Clara lit a candle and sat at her table, pulling out her journal. With careful strokes that would have been impossible months before, she recorded the events of the day, her heart full to bursting with newfound joy. January brought bitter cold to Wyatt and the surrounding countryside. Snow piled in drifts against buildings and fences, and the creek near Clara's property froze solid enough to walk across. Despite the harsh weather, Daniel faithfully made the journey to her cabin for their twice-weekly lessons, sometimes arriving with ice crusting his beard and eyebrows. Their studies had evolved as Clara's skills improved. Now they read together from Daniel's collection of classic literature, Ivanhoe, The Three Musketeers, and Clara's particular favorite, Jane Eyre. "She reminds me of you," Daniel remarked one evening as they discussed Charlotte Bronte's determined heroine. "Independent, resilient, unwilling to be defined by others' expectations." Clara smiled at the comparison. I think I still have much to learn from Jane, her courage especially." "You've courage in abundance," Daniel countered, taking her hand across the table. "It takes courage to begin learning at 22 what most learn as children, to face the mockery without letting it defeat you." His faith in her was still sometimes overwhelming, a gift she hadn't known how to accept at first, but now treasured beyond measure. In the 3 months since their lessons had begun, Clara had changed in ways that went beyond her newfound literacy. She stood straighter, spoke more confidently, and had begun to venture into town without the dread that had once accompanied such journeys. The townspeople had noted the change, and more significantly, her relationship with Daniel Zachary. Some, like Mr. Hawkins at the general store, treated her with new respect. Others, particularly Mrs. Hawkins and her circle, watched with narrow-eyed suspicion, whispering behind their hands whenever Clara appeared. "They think I'm after your money," Clara said bluntly one evening as they sat by her fire discussing an invitation to a February social at the church. Daniel looked up from the book he'd been examining. "What? The town gossips," Clara clarified. "I heard Mrs. Palmer telling Mrs. Hawkins that I'd set my cap for the richest rancher in the county, that I was using my feminine wiles to trap you." Daniel's expression darkened. "That's contemptible. It's predictable," Clara corrected with a sigh. "A poor woman being courted by a wealthy man, what other explanation could there be but cunning and calculation?" "Is that what we're doing?" Daniel asked, his voice softening. "Courting?" Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. They hadn't put a name to their relationship, though their growing closeness was undeniable. The kisses they shared at the end of each evening had become longer, more ardent. Their conversations delved deeper into hopes and dreams, values and beliefs. "I don't know what to call it," she admitted. "I only know that these past months have been the happiest of my life." Daniel set aside the book and moved to kneel before her chair, taking both her hands in his. "I know exactly what to call it, Clara Blackett. I'm in love with you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, momentous and perfect. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming joy of hearing words she'd never expected to be directed at her. "I love you too," she whispered, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. Daniel's smile was radiant as he leaned up to kiss her, his hands cradling her face as though she were something infinitely precious. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I don't care what anyone in town thinks or says," he murmured. "I know your heart, Clara. It's the truest thing I've ever known." The rest of January passed in a haze of happiness for Clara. Their lessons continued, but now they were interspersed with plans and dreams spoken aloud. Daniel talked of improvements he wanted to make to the ranch house to make it more comfortable, he said, his meaning clear though unspoken. Clara shared her ideas for expanding her garden in the spring, perhaps selling some of her produce in town. February brought the church social Daniel had mentioned, and this time Clara attended with her head high, secure in Daniel's affection and her own worth. Mrs. Hawkins and her friends still whispered, but their barbs seemed to have lost their sting. "You're positively glowing, dear," observed Mrs. Miller, the blacksmith's wife, as Clara helped arrange refreshments. "Love agrees with you." Clara blushed but didn't deny it. "Daniel is a good man. The best," Mrs. Miller agreed, "and not just because of his property or position. Thomas, my husband, says Daniel Zachary is the only rancher who treats his hands like men rather than tools, pays fair wages, provides decent housing." It was another confirmation of what Clara already knew, that Daniel's worth ran far deeper than his material success. Later that evening, as they danced together, Clara noticed Mrs. Hawkins watching them with a particularly sour expression. "She looks like she's been sucking lemons," Clara whispered, nodding discreetly in the woman's direction. Daniel glanced over, then back to Clara with a mischievous smile. "Shall we give her something real to gossip about?" Before Clara could ask what he meant, Daniel stopped in the middle of the dance floor, took both her hands in his, and dropped to one knee. A collective gasp went up from the gathered townspeople as conversations halted and all eyes turned to them. "Clara Blackett," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "you have brought light and joy into my life like I never thought possible. You're the bravest, kindest, most determined woman I've ever known. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Clara stared down at him, momentarily speechless. She was acutely aware of the watching crowd, some smiling, others open-mouthed in shock. "Mrs. Hawkins looked as though she might faint, but none of that mattered as she looked into Daniel's earnest face, his eyes full of love and hope. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Yes, I will." A cheer went up from many in the crowd as Daniel rose to his feet and swept her into an embrace, lifting her briefly off the ground in his enthusiasm. When he set her down, he reached into his pocket and produced a ring, a delicate gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the lamplight. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "My father gave it to her when he asked her to come west with him." Clara stared at the ring, then back at Daniel, overwhelmed by the moment and its significance. "It's beautiful." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations from well-wishers and tight-lipped felicitations from those less enthusiastic about the match. Clara barely noticed the latter, too wrapped in happiness to care about disapproval. As Daniel drove her home in his sleigh later that night, Clara leaned against his shoulder, watching the stars overhead. "Are you happy?" he asked, his arm secure around her. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly, "though I'm still in shock that you asked me in front of the entire town." Daniel chuckled. "I'd planned to ask you privately, but seeing Mrs. Hawkins's face, I couldn't resist the opportunity to silence the gossips once and for all." Clara smiled, thinking of the woman's stunned expression. It was worth it just for that. They agreed on a spring wedding April when the worst of winter would be past, but before the demands of calving season and spring planting became too pressing. In the meantime, there were preparations to be made and decisions to discuss. "Will you be comfortable living at the ranch?" Daniel asked as they sat by her fire the following Tuesday. "I know how much this place means to you." Clara looked around the small cabin that had been her home her entire life. It held memories of her parents, of her childhood, of the long, lonely months after their deaths. But it also held the memory of Daniel coming to her door that first evening, offering to teach her to read by candlelight. "This place will always be special to me," she said thoughtfully, "but it's not the walls or the land that matter most, it's what happened here." She reached for his hand. "I learned to read here, I found my voice here, I fell in love here, I can carry all that with me to our new home." Daniel's expression softened. "What if we kept it? We could lease the land to someone who would care for it properly but keep the cabin as it is. A place we could visit, maybe spend summers when the valley gets too hot." The suggestion touched Clara deeply. It was so like Daniel to understand what she hadn't fully articulated, her reluctance to completely sever ties with her past. "I'd like that," she said. "Very much." Over the following weeks, preparations for the wedding proceeded alongside their continuing lessons. Clara still had much to learn, but her progress had been remarkable. She could now read most books with minimal assistance, though some vocabulary still challenged her. Her writing had improved from laborious letter forming to fluid sentences. Her journal now filled with daily observations and reflections. "You've accomplished in months what takes many people years," Daniel told her one evening as they reviewed a letter she'd written to order seeds for her spring planting. Clara smiled, setting down her pencil. "I had proper motivation and an excellent teacher." "The best students make the best teachers look good," he replied, leaning across the table to kiss her lightly. As their wedding day approached, Clara found herself increasingly busy with preparations. Mrs. Miller and several other friendly townswomen offered assistance with her dress, a simple but elegant creation of cream-colored silk that Clara would never have been able to afford on her own. "It's our gift to you," Mrs. Miller insisted when Clara protested the expense. Every bride deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day. The gesture touched Clara deeply, especially coming from women who had once been mere acquaintances. Her relationship with Daniel had opened doors not just to knowledge, but to community, something she'd lacked since her parents' deaths. 2 weeks before the wedding, Clara received an unexpected visitor. She was in her garden, clearing winter debris in preparation for spring planting, when she looked up to see Mrs. Hawkins standing stiffly at her garden gate. "Mrs. Hawkins," Clara said, surprised and wary. "What brings you here?" The older woman's face was pinched, her hands clutching her reticule as though it might shield her from contamination. "May I speak with you, Miss Blackett?" Curious despite her reservations, Clara nodded toward the cabin. "Would you like to come in for tea?" "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Hawkins said quickly. "I'll be brief." She paused, seeming to gather herself before continuing. "I've come to express my concerns about your engagement to Mr. Zachary." Clara straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "I see. Mr. Zachary is one of the most eligible men in the county," Mrs. Hawkins continued. "He comes from good family, has substantial property, and holds a respected position in our community. He could have his choice of any young lady from a proper background." The implication was clear, but Clara merely raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I feel it my duty to point out that there is significant disparity between your situations," Mrs. Hawkins pressed on. "People will talk. They'll say you've entrapped him somehow, used feminine wiles to secure a wealthy husband. People already talk," Clara observed calmly. "They always have. About me, about others, about you, I imagine." Mrs. Hawkins flushed. "I'm merely concerned for Mr. Zachary's reputation." "That's very thoughtful," Clara replied, her voice steady. "But Daniel is quite capable of managing his own reputation and of choosing his own wife. You can't possibly offer him the kind of companionship a man in his position requires," Mrs. Hawkins insisted, her voice rising slightly. "A proper wife must be able to manage correspondence, entertain guests of quality, present herself with education and refinement." Clara regarded the woman for a long moment, noting the desperation beneath her haughty exterior. "Mrs. Hawkins, did you know your husband offered to help me with the ledger that day, before Daniel stepped in?" The older woman blinked, caught off guard by the change of subject. What? "Mr. Hawkins has always been kind to me," Clara continued, "even when others weren't. He sees people's worth beyond their circumstances or limitations." Mrs. Hawkins's lips thinned. "I don't see what this has to do with Daniel sees me the same way," Clara interrupted gently. "Not for what I lack, but for who I am and who I'm becoming." She gestured toward her cabin. "Did you know I can read now? Novels, newspapers, even some poetry. I've been learning these past months." "I had heard something of the sort," Mrs. Hawkins admitted, her certainty visibly faltering. "Daniel taught me," Clara said simply. "By candlelight after his long days at the ranch. Because he believed I could learn, even when I doubted it myself." She stepped closer to the fence separating them, her voice softening. "That's the man I'm marrying, Mrs. Hawkins. A man who sees possibilities where others see only limitations. Who values kindness over status, character over circumstance." Mrs. Hawkins stared at her, momentarily speechless. "I appreciate your concern," Clara concluded, "but I assure you Daniel and I have discussed all this. He knows exactly who I am and where I come from. And he loves me anyway, perhaps even because of it." The older woman's composure cracked slightly, something like pain flashing across her features before she masked it with renewed dignity. "I see I've wasted my time," she said stiffly. "Good day, Miss Blackett." As she turned to go, Clara called after her, "Mrs. Hawkins." The woman paused, looking back. "You're welcome to attend the wedding," Clara said. "We'd be honored by your presence." Mrs. Hawkins gave a curt nod before hurrying away down the path. That evening, when Daniel arrived for their regular lesson, Clara recounted the strange visit. "She actually came all the way out here to warn you against marrying me?" Daniel asked, incredulous. Clara nodded, pouring tea for them both. "She seemed genuinely concerned about your reputation." Daniel shook his head, accepting the cup she offered. Martha Hawkins has been managing the town's social hierarchy for 20 years. She can't abide anything that disrupts her carefully ordered world. I almost felt sorry for her, Clara admitted. She seemed afraid somehow. Daniel considered this. Perhaps she is. People who build their lives around judging others are often terrified of being judged themselves. Clara smiled at his insight. That's why I love you, Daniel Zachary. You see beneath the surface. Speaking of seeing things clearly, he said, reaching into his satchel, I brought something special tonight. He produced a newspaper, not the local Wyatt Weekly, but a larger publication from Denver. The Rocky Mountain News, Clara read from the masthead. What's the occasion? Daniel's eyes sparkled with excitement. Turn to page 3. Clara carefully opened the paper, counting pages until she reached the 3rd. There, in the middle of the page, was a small article with the heading Literary Achievement in Wyatt. Her breath caught as she began to read. The small town of Wyatt, Colorado, recently celebrated an achievement worth noting. Miss Clara Blackett, a local resident, has in the span of mere months progressed from complete illiteracy to reading competency through the dedicated instruction of Mr. Daniel Zachary, a prominent local rancher. Miss Blackett, who had no formal education, can now read complex literature and write with clarity. Her accomplishment stands as testament to the power of determination and the human capacity for learning at any age. Clara looked up, eyes wide with surprise. How did they? Mrs. Miller's son works for the paper, Daniel explained. She told him your story, our story, and he thought it worth sharing. But why would anyone care about my learning to read? Clara asked, genuinely puzzled. Because it's remarkable, Clara, Daniel said earnestly. What you've accomplished in such a short time, starting from nothing, it's extraordinary. And it might inspire others in similar circumstances to believe they can learn too. Clara read the article again, trying to see herself through others' eyes, not as the illiterate woman who was mocked for her ignorance, but as someone whose determination might actually inspire others. Thank you for showing me this, she said finally. It's hard to believe sometimes how much has changed. Daniel took her hand across the table. Everything has changed, and everything will keep changing. That's the wonder of it. Their wedding day dawned clear and mild, the April sun warming the earth after the long winter. Clara stood in her small bedroom, Mrs. Miller helping her into the cream silk gown they had created together. You look absolutely beautiful, the blacksmith's wife said, stepping back to admire her work. Daniel won't be able to take his eyes off you. Clara smiled nervously, turning to examine her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman who looked back at her seemed a stranger, poised, elegant, her hair arranged in a sophisticated knot adorned with small white flowers from her early spring garden. I hardly recognize myself, she admitted. Mrs. Miller squeezed her shoulder gently. You're still you, Clara, just in a fancy dress. The ceremony was held in the Wyatt church, filled to capacity with townsfolk and ranchers from the surrounding area. To Clara's surprise, many who had once whispered behind her back now smiled warmly as she walked down the aisle on Mr. Hawkins's arm. The storekeeper had kindly offered to give her away in the absence of her father, an offer that had moved Clara to tears when he made it. Daniel waited at the altar, handsome in a new black suit, his face lighting up when he saw her. As she reached him and placed her hand in his, Clara felt a sense of completion she had never known before. The minister's words washed over her as she stood beside Daniel, her attention caught not by the familiar ceremony, but by the journey that had brought them to this moment, a journey that had begun with mockery and shame, but had transformed into something beautiful beyond her imagining. When the time came to recite their vows, Clara spoke clearly and confidently, the words flowing from her heart through lips that now knew how to shape themselves around language, both written and spoken. I, Clara Blackett, take you, Daniel Zachary, to be my lawfully wedded husband. The words were traditional, but the meaning behind them was uniquely theirs, a promise born of candlelit lessons, of patience and perseverance, of seeing worth where others saw only lack. As Daniel slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, Clara caught sight of Mrs. Hawkins in the congregation. To her surprise, the older woman's eyes were damp, her expression softened from its usual severity. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Daniel's kiss was gentle yet filled with promise, the first of many they would share as husband and wife. As they turned to face the congregation, Clara felt a surge of joy so intense it almost overwhelmed her. They walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, into the spring sunshine and the future they would build side by side. The reception was held at the Zachary Ranch, the house and grounds transformed with flowers and ribbons. Tables had been set up on the lawn, laden with food prepared by Mrs. Ramsey and the church ladies. A small band played cheerful tunes as guests ate, drank, and celebrated the union of the unlikely pair. Clara moved among the guests, Daniel at her side, accepting congratulations and well wishes. Even those who had been skeptical of the match seemed won over by the obvious happiness of the couple. To Clara's surprise, Mrs. Hawkins approached them as the afternoon was waning, her husband at her side. "Mrs. Zachary," she said formally, using Clara's new name for the first time. "Mr. Zachary, congratulations on your nuptials." "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Hawkins," Clara replied sincerely. "It means a great deal to us." The older woman hesitated, then spoke again, her voice lower. I wish to apologize for my behavior, for what I said at your home and before that in the store." Clara exchanged a surprised glance with Daniel before responding. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Hawkins. Thank you. My wife has been reconsidering some of her assumptions," Mr. Hawkins said gently, his hand supportive on his wife's arm. Mrs. Hawkins nodded stiffly. "Indeed, I read the article in the Denver paper about your accomplishment. It was impressive." Coming from Mrs. Hawkins, this was high praise indeed. Clara smiled warmly. "Thank you, I had an excellent teacher." "You had determination," Daniel corrected. "The teacher was just lucky enough to be there." As the Hawkinses moved on to speak with other guests, Daniel leaned close to Clara's ear. "I believe you've won over your harshest critic." "People can change," Clara replied softly. "If I've learned anything these past months, it's that." As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the land, Daniel led Clara to the center of the gathering. The band struck up a waltz, and he took her in his arms for their first dance as husband and wife. "Happy, Mrs. Zachary," he murmured as they moved gracefully across the improvised dance floor. "Completely," she replied, her eyes never leaving his. "Though I'm still getting used to my new name." "You'll have plenty of time to practice writing it," he teased. "Perhaps in that journal of yours." Clara laughed, remembering how painstakingly she had practiced forming letters just months ago. "I may need to start a new one. The Chronicles of Clara Zachary has a nice ring to it." As they danced, Clara caught glimpses of their guests watching with approval, Mr. and Mrs. Miller raising their glasses in a toast, Mrs. Ramsey wiping away a tear, even Mrs. Hawkins with a grudging smile. This was her community now in a way it had never been before. When darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the property, casting a warm glow over the celebration. Guests gradually began to depart, offering final congratulations and good wishes. By the time the last wagon had disappeared down the drive, Clara was exhausted but happier than she had ever been. Daniel led her into the house, their house now, where Mrs. Ramsey had prepared the master bedroom with fresh linens and flowers. The room was large and comfortable, dominated by a four-poster bed that had belonged to Daniel's parents. "Welcome home, Clara," he said softly, closing the door behind them. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Clara's head resting on Daniel's shoulder, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a woman afraid to enter the general store for fear of mockery to the wife of the man she loved, mistress of a prosperous ranch, able to read and write and express herself fully. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, his fingers gently stroking her hair. Everything, she replied honestly. How much has changed, how different life is now from what I ever imagined it could be. Daniel's arm tightened around her, and this is just the beginning. Tell me, Clara said, nestling closer. Tell me what else is to come. In the darkness, she felt him smile. Tomorrow, we'll have breakfast on the porch and watch the sunrise over our land. Next week, I'll help you plant those fruit trees you've been wanting, apples and pears for preserves. By summer, we'll have the new room added to the west side of the house, the one with all the windows that you liked in the plans. Clara smiled at the domestic picture he painted. And beyond that, Daniel's voice softened. Beyond that, perhaps children, a boy with your determination. A girl with your gentle heart, a family to fill this house with laughter and learning. The thought brought happy tears to Clara's eyes. I'd like that, very much. We'll teach them together, Daniel continued, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. Reading and writing, yes, but also how to grow things as you do, how to care for animals, how to see the worth in people beyond what others might notice. How to be kind, Clara added, how to believe in possibilities. How to love, Daniel concluded, drawing her closer. Above all, how to love. Clara closed her eyes, safe in her husband's arms, her heart full of gratitude for the man who had seen potential where others saw only limitation, who had taught her not just to read words but to read the world with new eyes. Outside their window, the stars wheeled slowly in their ancient patterns, witnesses to the beginning of a new chapter in a story still being written, a story of learning and love that had started by candlelight and would continue day by day in the bright light of their shared future. 5 years later, Clara stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching as Daniel rode in from the north pasture, their 3-year-old son Tommy perched proudly in front of him on the saddle. Behind them came 2 ranch hands, driving a small herd of cattle toward the corral. Mama. Tommy called, waving excitedly. We found the lost calf, Clara smiled and waved back, adjusting the infant daughter sleeping in her arms. Little Rose, just 6 months old, stirred briefly before settling back against her mother's shoulder. As Daniel dismounted and lifted Tommy down, Clara's heart swelled with the same joy that had become familiar, yet never diminished over the years of their marriage. Her husband looked much the same as the day she'd first collided with him in the general store, perhaps with a few more lines at the corners of his eyes, testament to years of squinting in the Colorado sun. Successful mission? She asked, as Daniel climbed the porch steps to kiss her hello. Very, he confirmed, his eyes warming as he gazed at their daughter. Has she been asleep long? About an hour, Clara replied. Just in time for you 2 adventurers to return. Tommy tugged at his father's sleeve. Can I go help with the horses, Pa? Sam said I could watch him brush them down. Daniel exchanged a glance with Clara, who nodded her approval. Go ahead, but mind what Sam tells you. No wandering off. As their son ran toward the stables, Daniel settled beside Clara on the porch swing, his arm slipping comfortably around her shoulders. How was your day? He asked, gently touching Rose's downy head. Productive, Clara replied. I finished the last batch of apple preserves, 24 jars from our own trees. Mrs. Miller came by to help, and she's taking half to sell at the church bazaar next week. The apple orchard they had planted in their first year of marriage was now bearing abundantly, fulfilling Clara's dream of selling preserves in town. What had begun as a small side enterprise had grown into a thriving business, with Zachary preserves now sought after throughout the county. And I received a letter from the Denver Ladies Literary Society, Clara continued, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. They've invited me to speak at their November meeting about adult literacy. Apparently, the newspaper article about our reading program has generated quite a bit of interest. Daniel smiled proudly. That's wonderful news. Will you accept? I think I will, Clara said, still marveling at the invitation. Though the idea of speaking to a room full of educated women is rather daunting. You'll be magnificent, Daniel assured her. No one could speak more convincingly about the importance of literacy than someone who has experienced both sides. The reading program he mentioned had been Clara's idea, born 2 years earlier after she encountered a young woman in town struggling as Clara once had. With Daniel's encouragement, she had begun offering free reading lessons 2 afternoons a week in a back room at the church. What started with a single student had grown to a class of 12 men and women of various ages, all eager to learn what Clara had mastered. "I received something else today as well," Clara said, reaching into her pocket with her free hand. She withdrew a letter bearing the return address of a publishing house in Boston. "My manuscript was accepted." Daniel's face lit up with delighted surprise. "Clara, that's incredible news." The manuscript was a collection of simple reading lessons Clara had developed for her adult students, along with stories designed to engage grown readers while using limited vocabulary. She had sent it to the publisher on Mrs. Miller's suggestion, never truly expecting a response. "They want to publish it next spring," she continued, still hardly believing it herself. "They think it will be useful for adult education programs throughout the country." Daniel pulled her closer, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "I always knew you were extraordinary, even when you didn't believe it yourself." Clara rested her head against his shoulder, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and pink. "Sometimes I still can't quite believe how everything has changed. For the better, I hope." Daniel asked, though the question was merely teasing he knew the answer well. "Beyond anything I could have imagined," Clara confirmed, turning to meet his gaze. From a woman afraid to enter the general store to a teacher, a business owner, soon to be a published author. "Sometimes it seems like a dream." "Not a dream," Daniel murmured, kissing her gently. "Just a different story than the one you thought you were in." Clara smiled at his literary reference. In the years since their marriage, they had read hundreds of books together, their evenings often spent by the fire with one reading aloud while the other listened. The shelves in Daniel's study, now their shared library, had expanded to accommodate Clara's growing collection alongside his inherited volumes. From the corral came Tommy's delighted laughter, as one of the ranch hands lifted him onto the fence for a better view of the horses. Rose stirred again in Clara's arms, her tiny face scrunching briefly before relaxing back into sleep. "Our story," Clara said softly, taking in the scene of their thriving ranch, their beautiful children, the life they had built together. "The best one I know." Daniel's eyes crinkled with the smile that still made her heart skip. "And we keep adding chapters." As the evening deepened around them, Clara thought of how far she had come from that shameful day in the general store when she couldn't read the simplest labels. She thought of the candles burning low as Daniel patiently helped her form her first letters, of the pride she felt writing her name for the first time, of all the doors that had opened since she learned to read. But most of all, she thought of love, the kind that sees beyond limitations to possibilities, that teaches and learns in equal measure, that grows stronger with each challenge overcome and each joy shared. In the gathering dusk, with her family around her and her heart full of contentment, Clara Zachary knew with absolute certainty that some stories, the very best ones, never truly end. They simply continue, page after page, chapter after chapter, each day a new word in a narrative of possibility that extends beyond what any single person could write alone. And that, she decided as Daniel drew her and their sleeping daughter closer against the evening chill, was the most beautiful story of all.